The U.S. has launched a series of strikes in retaliation for the strike against a base in Jordan that killed 3 U.S. soldiers last weekend. Plans for airstrikes in Syria and Iraq were approved earlier this week. The Pentagon said it wanted to avoid a wider conflict in the region, but said it would take all steps necessary to defend the U.S. and its interests and its troops. President Biden has said he holds Iran responsible for supplying weapons to militant groups who carried out the attack on U.S. troops. With us now is retired U.S. Marine Corps Colonel Mark Cancian. He's a senior advisor with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Okay, so we're just getting our first details about the depth and breadth of these strikes. What's your assessment?
Well, the attacks are certainly significant. There are a lot of munitions against a lot of facilities. It sends a pretty strong message. And these facilities have value to these groups. On the other hand, the groups have had several days to move personnel and equipment away so that the damage would likely be minimized. And to put it in perspective, in 2017, when President Trump attacked a Syrian air base that was using its facilities against the resistance in Syria, they launched 59 Tomahawks, about half of what we're seeing here. But that was a case where U.S. forces were not involved. So, this is significant, but it's maybe not the overwhelming response that the administration had signaled.
So just cut through the noise here. Is this an effort to show that the U.S. is retaliating, but at the same time avoid any possibility of escalation with Iran?
Well, the administration certainly does not want to escalate with Iran. Both sides have been essentially attacking outside their homeland. We've never struck, or hasn't struck for many decades, the Iranian homeland, and we won't do that here. We'll strike their proxies. But we're hoping that this sends a message. And I certainly hope that we hear from the administration that if these attacks don't decrease, then we will launch another set of strikes.
What we heard from U.S. officials throughout the week is that it was going to be a series of strikes, a multi-layered approach over several days, and they would be targeting personnel as well as operational capabilities inside Iraq and Syria. But it just seems that we've been pounding these sites for weeks, not only the U.S., but others, and it hasn't had a deterrent effect. So what would make this different?
Well, this particular set of strikes doesn't appear to be different, at least what we've heard publicly. There may be some cumulative effect. This might be the first wave. Maybe there'll be another wave, and cumulatively that will convince these groups to ease up their attacks in the United States. They're not going to stop, and they certainly aren't going to negotiate some sort of ceasefire. They get a lot of credibility by attacking the United States, but what we need them to do is to back off. Of course, we've heard that there is something like 160 strikes on U.S. Forces, and that's what we need to bring down.
What's your sense of the relationship between these proxy groups and Iran? They're clearly being funded and trained and equipped by Iran, but the argument from the administration is that they're not being directed by Iran. Is this a difference without a significance?
I think it is. Iran provides them with weapons. It provides them with training. It provides them with guidance. Now, they aren't puppets. These are groups that operate in their own right, and their interests are aligned with Iran's, not necessarily identical. But if Iran wanted the groups to stop, they could force them to stop. I mean, they could cut off the flow of weapons, for example, and they can lean on them in various ways.
Let's just drill down a little bit more on the targets in what may be the first wave of these retaliatory strikes. CENTCOM, which is the command that has control over the Middle East region, has said that there were 85 targets and 125 precision munitions. You and I both know those munitions can be used to attack real deep targets that could be important to command and control. So give us a sense of what they were after and what they were not after in these strikes.
Well, they've described a variety of military targets. When you hear command and control site, that means a headquarters. There are logistics bases. There are apparently some equipment that we were able to locate. So these are classic military targets. We haven't heard much about personnel, and there is certainly going to be some casualties on their side, but those may not be very large, given that they've had time to move away from these sites.
Does it sound to you like among the targets set was HVTs or high-value targets like the leadership in these proxy groups, or do you think so much time has passed that it's a foregone conclusion that most of them have left the region?
I have no doubt that we would like to hit some of these high value targets, some of the commanders. That's very hard to do. You have to have very accurate information, and not just accurate, but you have to have timely. In other words, since they're moving all the time, you have to have information up to the hour. We tried to do this against Iraq in 2003 and failed miserably, even though we had really pretty good intelligence. So it's worth trying, but our track record is not very good. Eventually, you get a couple. They're not invulnerable, but it's very hard to do.
We're talking a lot about the military piece here, but what about the economic piece? Is that something Tehran really understands? Really severe sanctions or the seizure of Iranian assets, could that also help put a stop to this?
It's unlikely that further sanctions will change their behavior. Sanctions, have been a pretty blunt instrument. It does make a point, and it does make life uncomfortable for them. And perhaps, the cumulative effect of these strikes and sanctions and other actions will convince them, again, to back off. But the history has not been very encouraging.
Retired U.S. Marine Corps Colonel Mark Cancian, thank you for your analysis during this breaking news.
Thanks for having me.
CBS News correspondent Christina Ruffini and CBS News contributor Sam Vinograd joins us now. She's also a former assistant secretary for counterterrorism at the Department of Homeland Security. Sam, you're just out of government, so take us inside the White House and the Situation Room. What are these conversations that are developing at this hour?
Well, there are multiple lines of effort underway. What we're seeing right now is just one piece of that. As these strikes are launched in the Situation Room right now, there are undoubtedly briefings about the impact of these strikes. Did they hit any high-value targets? Did they actually degrade any capability to strike U.S. forces? Concurrently, there is likely an intelligence briefing on how the Iranian regime is reacting to these strikes. Do they anticipate that the Iranian regime views these as retaliatory and we're going to dial down the temperature? Or is the Iranian regime viewing these as combative and likely to respond in a more elevated way? Concurrently, there is a huge force protection element here. As these strikes are being launched, the president and his National Security Council are probably reviewing intelligence about any specific and credible threats to U.S. forces overseas, as well as embassies and consulates, as well as American citizens more broadly. When I was in government, one of the president's top priorities was ensuring that the hundreds of thousands of Americans in the region were safe, that our embassies and consulates and military bases had the security assets that they needed to deter threats. We saw a successful drone strike in Jordan just a few days ago. So that force protection and security piece is certainly at play. Third, there have to be private messages going to the Iranians right now to say, this was our opening salvo. If you continue these tit-for-tat strikes with us, we will elevate. We didn't strike Iran today, but nothing is off the table if you don't dial down the temperature. And then finally, I don't think we can discount the fact that the administration is talking about any threats to the homeland. Iran has a demonstrated intent and capability to try to strike the homeland. And the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, the Department of Justice, and others have to be looking at the threat picture here as it pertains to operatives trying to come into the country, as well as violent extremists here that are feeling inspired by what's happening overseas. So I would imagine that Homeland Security and the FBI are on a heightened state of alert.
I want to bring in Christina and talk about the number of days that had passed since this drone strike that killed these U.S. service members. Christina, based on your reporting, was it possible for our military assets to be sort of postured and positioned to act more quickly?
I've heard frustration from sources inside CENTCOM that they were expecting a bigger reaction sooner. Right. People in the region were very upset at the loss of life, were very upset at the amount of injury to U.S. forces, and they wanted a big reaction. And as the days ticked on, there was increasing frustration I was hearing from even ground level folks in the area that the U.S. hadn't struck back yet. So on my end, what I'd heard is there was a technical capability, but a lack of political will. And that's what caused the delay. Now, whether that was deliberate or whether there was deliberation as to what exactly the strike was and it took them that long to figure out what they wanted to do, I don't have that reporting, but I know there was a disconnect between what people were expecting and how long it took the administration to respond.
Before we came on the air, I spoke with a very seasoned special operations soldier, and I asked him for his feedback on the target set that we're seeing right now. And one of the first things he said is that these are fixed targets. These are target packages that CENTCOM, the central command that oversees the area, would have prepped and on the shelf to attack. So he too questioned the days-long period since the drone attack and then the launching of these strikes. So, Sam, take us back inside the White House. What kind of discussions would have factored in to a decision to go tonight versus immediately after this drone strike?
Well, I think it would have been irresponsible to react too quickly in the following way. As these strikes are happening, I've been in the Situation Room when the military is about to do something overseas. And again, one of the core questions is, are there going to be reverberations from these strikes that are going to hurt Americans? And so the national security team, the Homeland Security team, has to make sure that they have security assets in place if the adversary chooses to retaliate. And so if we had just launched straight after we had lost our service members and many others were injured, we could not have guaranteed the safety and security of our assets overseas, most likely, nor the homeland. So I think that was certainly part of the calculus. I also would imagine that, again, communicating to the Iranians through various channels what the intent of these strikes were was also a consideration. We don't communicate directly with the Iranians.
Yeah, let me just stop you there, because I don't think our viewers necessarily understand that when we have a message for the Iranians, we don't pick up the phone to them and say, hey, here's the deal, this is what we're planning, and this is our expectation. We're going through third parties, right?
Indeed. We do not have a direct hotline to the regime in Tehran. There are various channels that are used to convey messages to the Iranians. The president spoke about this just a few days ago, and he confirmed that there was a private message to Iran. But that takes time. And what we never really know is whether the Iranians actually believe those messages or not, whether they believe that they're credible. And I think that's why we've seen various other players come into the conversation and be part of the discussions with the Iranians that the Iranians, frankly, trust more than us, like the Chinese or the Saudis at this point or others. And so the fact that this took time, to me, is not a show of weakness. It was careful planning, steps to try to protect our personnel overseas and to communicate with the Iranians. And I would not discount the fact that there would be more strikes after this. I think this was an opening salvo. Okay,
Christina, I want to bring you back into the conversation. Based on your reporting, what are you hearing from people in the region about efforts to change their security posture or shore up their security in response to these strikes?
I will say, to Sam's point, one thing that we've heard the administration, the State Department, and everyone is very worried about is the safety and security of our personnel on the ground in U.S. installations, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in these areas that are Egypt. We have been watching these embassies waiting to hear that they're drawing down. And so far, other than Iraq, which they actually evacuated kind of in an odd way, almost in the middle of the night, they have to announce when they're evacuating a U.S. embassy because it puts American personnel in the country at risk. So it's a public disclosure they have to make. And they made it in a way that didn't flag it so they could pull some of that staff out overnight. But there is still, the embassy is still staffed up. It's still operating. And we've been watching to see if they're going to draw down. And there's this very difficult calculation the administration has to make where the diplomatic optics of pulling Americans out of an embassy is a really big deal. And that in itself could spark further conflict and could be the impetus for more strikes. So they don't want to do that. But at the same time, they don't want to put Americans in harm's way. So it's a day-by-day, hour-by-hour calculation. And we're hearing, security has already been very high the last couple months throughout the region. We're hearing they're doubling down on those measures. And like I said, they are in those rooms reevaluating that situation on an almost hourly basis. And it's something I've talked to people in the region and people at headquarters here are very concerned about.
Well, just talk to us about the fact that there are some countries in the region now where we don't have an embassy presence, right? And what does that mean for us in terms of eyes and ears on the ground and intelligence gathering?
It always makes it more difficult. I mean, obviously, we don't have diplomatic relations with Syria. We don't have official diplomatic relations with Iran. We go through proxy nations and all those places. But when you have an embassy that's there and locked down and not functioning in the way an embassy needs to, that also makes it more difficult, right? If your personnel can't go out and meet with their counterparts, if they're not getting a read of what it's like on the ground, what the population is feeling, what the unrest is feeling, what's bubbling up, that's not them running on their full capacity either. So it just makes it very difficult for everyone to do their jobs under this heightened security status. But it has to be that way because they don't want anything to happen to U.S. personnel.
So, Sam, I want to drill down on something you said earlier, which is you believe this may be the first wave or the first salvo in something larger, and much will depend on the responses or the messaging that we pick up from Iran. Let's just talk about that process. How does that work, and how do you assess that intelligence?
Well, I will say, just to Christina's point, I lived through Benghazi, I lived through the Arab Spring. I started my career in Iraq when we were mortared daily by Iranian proxies. I will confirm that there are not hourly, daily, or twice daily discussions about embassy and consulate security, to include actual threats to the embassies and consulates, any additional assets that have to be brought in to protect them, and what that tipping point is between keeping staff in country and doing some sort of supported departure of personnel. Even when we shut down embassies and consulate, there are still hundreds of thousands of Americans in the region. And to your direct question, as the administration is thinking about whether to launch the next phase. Ostensibly, they have a concept of operations right now about what stage 2 looks like, stage 3, and so on and so on. As that concept of operations is being reviewed, they are likely evaluating the Iranian regime's reaction, and both in terms of how they interpret air attacks and whether they strike back. Iran is more than likely not going to take the sitting down. They can't not respond at all. But if they respond in a way where they don't actually do anything that really endangers Americans' lives or assets, we know that they're starting to de-escalate. And so the administration will be evaluating the actual direct response as well as whatever is garnered through intelligence.
I know what you're talking about, but I want our viewers to understand that. So what would that look like from Iran, a signal that they are de-escalating?
I think if we see Iran retaliate by launching rockets or mortars at U.S. sites that are easily defended, or launching strikes in a way that does not really endanger U.S. lives, that'll be a sign of de-escalation. We've had various proxies say that they're going to take a step back and that they're not going to strike and this and that. I don't put any credence in what the proxies say because their actions speak louder than words. And if the proxies launch strikes, again, that don't directly endanger Americans, then I think we can assume the regime has given them a message to step back.
Because there are certain installations in the region that are getting hit all the time.
Sure.
Like a lot of our facilities in Iraq are hit regularly, and Syria. And it's, to your point, they're well fortified. They're, for lack of a better word, a little bit used to it. So, yeah, if pot shots, as one of our other contributors was saying earlier, if the Iranians just take a couple pot shots in the next couple weeks, you think that's a sign that they're de-escalating?
I do, and that's quite different than launching a drone strike on a U.S. installation in Jordan that has not been struck before and is less well fortified. There are various military installations in the region that, again, are used to this, unfortunately, and so it'll be very interesting to analyze what Iran actually does from a response perspective.
I think the bottom line for a lot of folks watching at home is whether we're on the cusp of a wider regional conflict. Christina, I'll start with you. I know I'm just asking you to give your best assessment.
I think that's the question that has been asked in a lot of situation rooms all week. That's a question I've been having to ask officials from all over the region. Everyone is very concerned about that. And look, as we've talked about these various proxies, that Iran has various levels of control and that all have slightly different objectives. Those objectives are not all going to align, and they're not all going to align in the same direction, whether that benefits the U.S. or not, whether that benefits the current conflict between Israel and Hamas or not. So there's no one predictor. It's kind of a messy bowl of things, and you got to try to keep the lid on all of them at the same time. So I think that was a big part of this calculation with the administration wanting to show that they had responded, but not responding in a way that's going to escalate it. At least they hope not at this point.
I agree, and that's why I think we should wait to see if we hear from the president at some time in the next couple of days, as well as how our allies react in the region.
Sam and Christina, thank you both for your analysis with this breaking news.